Good morning, everybody. This is Sam Albrecht. I'm the Director of the Office of Regulatory Oversight. We are going to be having this meeting of the Technical Advisory Committee to discuss the emergency rule that was passed recently by the State Housing Board. Our goal is to make that, or our recommendation from staff is to make that a permanent rule. And in order to do that, we need to follow the emergency rule procedure that is put out by the Secretary of State, which means we need to start that process tomorrow. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and we will jump into the presentation. This shouldn't be a long meeting. We should be able to get through this by the end of the hour for sure. All right, just want to check and make sure everybody can see that screen okay?
Great.
Okay, good. All right, so like I said, this meeting was publicly noticed. If you want to make a comment, good. Amelia's got audio now, fantastic. Amelia, if you could watch the participant list for me and the chat list for me, like you normally do, that'd be great. So I want to do introductions real quick, then go over some guidelines and scope of this discussion, and then talk about that emergency rule real quick, and then get down into the future rulemaking, because I do think we're going to have to set up another rulemaking later in the fall. We're pretty late in the fall, either December or January to get started, and then we'll just wrap this thing up. So as I mentioned, I'm Sam Albrecht. I'm the Director of the Office of Regulatory Oversight. We went through the administrative rules together with the TAC last year, and they were approved by State Housing Board. And also with me today, I have Amelia Spinner. Amelia is our Director of Administration, and she takes care of all the program coordinators and also helps Donnie and I out with complaints. As I mentioned, Donnie's not able to join us today. With that, I want to do the introduction to the TAC members. I'll go around and call on you guys as I see you, and we will introduce yourselves. We've got one new TAC member here, and that's Charlie. And then we have another new TAC member that was unable to join us, and that's Dean with EV Studios. He's going to be filling the architect position. Justin, you want to go first?
Sure. Justin Flucky, structural engineer.
Okay. Sean Roos, you want to go next?
Yeah, Sean Roos, Clayton Homes, Grand Junction, Colorado, retailer.
Great. Tim Pate.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Tim Pate, I'm City and County of Broomfield Building Division Chief Building Official. Good to see almost everybody back in the team. Thanks.
You bet. Charlie, you want to introduce yourself to the team?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for including me. Yeah, I'm Charlie Chupp, the CEO of Fading West, modular builder out in Buena Vista.
Fantastic. And that is normally the TAC is 15 people, but this was kind of a late minute notice, and I did get a couple of folks who said they were not able to make it, but we've got enough to keep going forward on this. Just some guidelines overview and scope. We don't have any other members of the public here, so I'll skip that. But for when we get started with the regular meeting of the TAC, we do get some public occasionally that drops in, and this number 2 is for them. Well, 1 and 2, we give priority time to the TAC members because we have a lot of work to do and a limited amount of time to get it done. And then for number 2, I ask them to take a look at the controlling statute, the administrative rules, and previous meeting recordings, which are on the website. today, we're only addressing the emergency rule as passed by the State Housing Board on 10/24/23. And again, sometimes we stray out of Colorado law and talk about what other states are doing. We are driven by statute, so we're only addressing Colorado law and Colorado rules. And then to keep us moving, if you have any comments after the meeting that you want to send to me, please try to write them in the form of a rule. Again, this is more for the public who often have a lot of questions. Why are we doing this? We will try to answer those questions if we have time. So here's the emergency rule that we adopted. And then let me set this up with a little background. As you know, the mayor of Denver has declared a local state of emergency in order to, his goal is, it's dealing with homelessness in the city and county of Denver. Their goal is to house 1,000 people by the end of the year, and that's a very aggressive time schedule. They are looking at multiple ways of doing that. They are buying and leasing hotels and motels and converting those into apartments. They're also buying pallet shelters. And their other wish for about 200 plus units is to allow factory built structures to fill the other that 200 plus segment. And so they approached us and we met with their team and talked about how to do that. And the consensus was, let's do an emergency rule that will allow factory built structures to use local standards or building types. In this situation, they have a very specific building type called RX, which is a sleeping unit, a sleeping shelter. And this sleeping shelter is for lack of a better way of saying it, is a blend between an IBC residential type and an IRC residential type. And what it basically does is it allows these structures to be put a little closer together with a little bit of different requirements, only in the city and county of Denver. And they will have community buildings, which are also factory built structures, to provide restrooms, showers, kitchens, and community meeting rooms for these camps that they're setting up. So again, very short timeline. Leadership decided to go ahead and do this emergency rule. We have filed that emergency rule with the Attorney General and got back a clean opinion. That clean opinion now allows us to move it to be published in the Colorado Register. So that will be going out on that'll go out on the 15th edition of that. Emergency rules are only good for 120 days. After 120 days, the emergency rule expires. So what we would like to do is make this a permanent rule, and that's why we're here today. In order to make it a permanent rule, I have to file tomorrow to avoid any gap between the emergency rule and the permanent rule. It's not life and death that we have a gap. If I can't pull the State Housing Board together in order to get it done, we may have a little bit of a gap, but I think we'll be okay. So we are, the other things about this rule are that these structures, again, will get a building codes and standards insignia that designates them as a emergency structure. And only good for the city and county of Denver. Now we're working with the city and county. They've got a couple different snow loads and wind loads that we're trying to take care of. And
Sam, we've got a question in the chat from Tim Pate.
Okay, good. Do these have to be fire sprinklers? No, Tim, they do not. If you want to look up Denver building code, it's a RX structure. They do not have to have fire sprinklers. I do believe they will have fire extinguishers and smoke alarms, but they do not have to be sprinkled. Good question.
Are you taking questions now?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
All right. How long is the insignia good for?
So the insignia is as good for as long as the structure stands. They are built to be long-term. They don't go on a permanent foundation. They're going to go on a temporary foundation, but they will be tied down. And so the reason that we have the insignia in there is in case they decide to move them or sell them, that the local jurisdictions can see exactly what criteria they were built to. And so that's why we have that insignia in there.
So the less stringent thing is where I'm kind of struggling with this. We're allowing these buildings to have a less stringent design, and during this time period, and then after this period, they can sell or move them as they please without reverting back to the full design criteria.
That's a good question. So their intent is to keep them. They think this is going to continue to be a problem. We insisted on putting an insignia in them in case they did try to sell or move or use for some other purpose. And they are going to come in on the back of a flatbed and be set in place. So they technically could be moved or sold. But they would have to be accepted by any other local jurisdiction.
And by less stringent design, are we talking structural in addition to, like you said, fire separation and things like that? What portion of design is going to be allowed less stringent?
So some of it is exactly what I said, and it's a good question. Is the spacing of the units? They are on the 2021 IRC and IBC, so they're building to that design standard as far as wind, snow conditions. Insulation requirements are unique in the Denver Building Code also. The goal of this rule would be, again, to allow a fairly quick response to locally approved building codes.
I'm good with that part. It's
that answers your question.
Afterwards.
Yeah, afterwards, right? I don't know that we have a good answer for that, to be honest, on what the long-term use of these structures would be, other than as sleeping shelters, because that's what they're designed to be built. We would, if any other local jurisdiction wanted to come back and get a plan set, they could reference that. Insignia, and we could provide the construction drawings if they wanted to review them before they allowed them someplace else.
Are these privately owned or are these city owned?
These are city owned. The customer here is the city and county of Denver.
Is that clear in this statement?
No, I don't think it is. And so let's talk through that. That's a really good question. So if they were privately owned, and I see some movement out in homeless response for nonprofits to start providing units. These are kind of designed as a transitional housing step in the homeless shelter initiatives. If you think it's important to the group, we could take a look at adding something to that in order for this rule to be applied, it has to be a local or state declared emergency. And they have to request it in writing from us to allow it. Now, I would think that if City and County of Denver had a developer that wanted to do this and they asked us to do it, we would consider that also. If the developer or a nonprofit, I'm thinking nonprofit specifically in this, wanted to fund this, would we change anything in the way that we do it? And I guess I'll throw that back to the group and see if that's important to you.
It's important to me that it's defined only for the city. I don't think that it should be for profit, or if it's a nonprofit, like you said, they can fund it through the city and let the city own it, but have rules to designate where it goes.
Yeah, I don't mind adding a not-for-profit section in there. Does everybody else think that's a good idea?
You know, honestly, I'm curious, why wouldn't you want for-profit developers helping you solve this problem if they can figure out a way to do this profitably?
Because this is a state of emergency, and this is not to be capitalized on, in my opinion.
Well, I don't know the method is I don't believe the method is I mean, the end goal is a housing and getting people into housing. Why would it matter if the capital markets worked for you?
I'm saying the owner of the building. I don't mind that, factories make profit selling these buildings to the city, but for them to be privately owned after the emergency's over, I don't think is right.
I've got a comment. This is Tim Pate. I think, in my opinion, I had a couple of questions in the chat, but when I saw this come through, I think I tend to agree with what Denver's doing, saying a state of emergency. I think that was kind of stretching the bounds of what the intent of this section is for what we would normally call a state of emergency. Say you had a wildfire, say you had tornado, flood, and it's a short-term fix that is not intended to be a long-term solution. And this is just stretching the bounds in my mind, saying, homelessness in the eyes of the mayor, who got elected with that, part of that. But to me, this is opening up the door. And I think some of these questions of, what happens when the state of emergency stops, which it will, either by the current mayor, or by a new mayor. And then what happens, how are these units recognized as they're sitting there with less stringent standards than a normal developer? So those are just my thoughts of kind of where this is coming up. I think it's stretching the bounds of what a state of emergency is. I know he called it a state of emergency, but like the Marshall Fire or the floods of 2013, those I can think under the, our codes, and even the new state electric ready and, solar ready code that's going into effect has the, waiver for state of emergency. But I would not say that homelessness state of emergency would comply with that.
So Tim, it's a good point. So specifically, if a new mayor comes in or that state of emergency ends, these units would still be valid to sit there because they've been built under this emergency rule, right? And they've got a state insignia on them. Where they go next is a tougher question. And what I thought when we looked at this was, how do we write this permanent rule for those exact situations that you brought up? There's apparently limited FEMA shelters. So if there was a flood or a tornado or a wildfire, how do we allow quick responses from manufacturers of factory built structures to help be part of the problem? I'm sorry, part of the solution. I was talking to the pallet shelter folks the other day because again, I needed to better understand how those are, and they said their actual design life on that is 15 years. Now I'm not sure what a 15-year-old pallet shelter is going to look like, but those are open construction basically, and don't fall underneath our program. So with that said, I want to jump to the next slide just to kind of put the rule in context of where it fits within 2.15. We've had 2.15 for a long time in the codes rule that the Division of Housing will consider modifications to the standards or alternate materials and methods of construction. The Division of Housing will require that sufficient evidence or proof be submitted to support and substantiate the modification or alternate request. We thought at first that this would be we could allow these RX structures underneath this, but we wanted to tighten it up a little bit and tie it to a locally declared state of emergency. And maybe the assumption there was that it is a request of the city and county of Denver, and they are the owners here. So I'm perfectly happy with putting the limitation that they are owned by the local jurisdiction making the request.
Yeah, I still any limitation, it feels to me like we're putting boundaries on how to solve a big problem. I understand that I'm trying to think through the consequences or the ramifications of having private ownership of these at some point in the future. But I don't even know if that's bad. Let's say that there is a private developer who builds a bunch of these after the emergency is over. What is wrong with that becoming the developer's asset? It's helped solve an emergency.
Nothing if they bring their building up to standards.
But aren't we talking about this being a modification? I mean, what is the standard? It's IRC, IBC. There's changes in some of the codes. Yeah, I just don't understand. I don't know why this wouldn't be, if it's acceptable housing during an emergency. What is keeping it from being acceptable housing after emergency?
Why don't we just decrease the code for everybody then?
Well, I would vote for that too.
That's what I'm saying. It's just not fair to everybody else that complies with the design standards during a non-state of emergency. And like you said, a developer come in, build a bunch of these units. They're cheaper now. They're profiting off of a state of emergency, which I don't think is right.
Well, it'd be profiting after the state of emergency was declared over. Do we think the homeless crisis is going to be solved anytime soon in Denver? I mean, I understand the point. I mean, I get what you're saying. I don't know the developer is going to go into it thinking this is a long-term profitable strategy. I think it's going to be more missional focused organizations that are going to want to come in and be a part of solving this. There's a lot of, missional investors, missional developers, nonprofits that would hate to cut out of part of the solution.
And I'm not saying private ownership is bad. It's just controlling what happens to it after the fact.
So first of all, these can't be classified as IRC dwellings because they don't have a bathroom or a kitchen in them, right? Tim, you asked about heat. They are electric heat and electric air, I believe. And I believe that Denver is on the 2021 energy code, so they're going to have to comply with that. But there was some discussion between city and county of Denver and us on the floor insulation. And I think that they have made an exception on some of the insulation standards under this state of emergency. So I seriously doubt they could be used someplace else. I seriously doubt a manufacturer is going to see this as a profit center for to be able to build these units. I could see where they, if there was, say, a Louisville Superior fire and there was a need for this type of shelter, again, with the proper support of a community structure that is also goes with these units to provide showers, restrooms, toilets, sorry, and kitchen room facilities. I just can't see them being used very much. And what the city and county of Denver does once they own these things, I don't think they're going to be. I don't even think they could be sold as loafing sheds for horses, right? They just are not going to qualify. These are fairly small structures. I think they're 120 square feet.
Okay.
And so I still don't mind the idea, the idea of making sure that they are adding a clause in there that they're owned by the local jurisdiction. Let them come up with the funding for that.
So
Could we say something, and I won't belabor the point, but just a question is, could we say something about that they maybe not be owned, but managed by the local housing authority, if not directly by
Yeah.
something like that? Because that would then, you do have if you had a housing authority that took over management after the emergency, there's still control of it by, a government entity.
So I got a couple comments if I could jump in. I know that this has come up because, and you correct me if I'm wrong, specifically with Denver, city and county of Denver, and the state of emergency as called by the mayor, and trying to help with that situation. But it's my understanding that what we're talking about here is expanding this, I should say, changing this emergency rule to be just a regular rule and could be used anywhere in any city or any county throughout Colorado. Is that correct?
Only if they have declared a state of emergency.
Understood. Yep.
Yep.
Exactly. So, I mean, that's the criteria.
Yeah. That's
So since there's no definition of state of emergency, it's going to be up to that local, whatever that is. And, as I went back to my other comments, to me, it's stretching the bounds, but, the concept has always been, for a weather type situation, but that's not, always going to be the case. So a lot of jurisdictions, the comment we just heard was, well, if you had a housing authority that could take in and manage it, Broomfield, we have a housing authority, but we don't manage anything. And we're a pretty good sized county, city and county. I think a lot of jurisdictions don't have that, and they don't want to have they don't want to get involved with owning housing. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. So if this becomes permanent, then a permanent rule, I should say, then any city or county could go to the Division of Housing and request, to be able to potentially reduce the code required built structures. And then have them there for some period of time. I think for a short period of time, I don't have a problem with that to get through an emergency.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, some of the comments we've heard, do I believe that the housing problem is going to, homelessness problem is going away? No, it's not. And it's unfortunately, it's, everywhere. I mean, anywhere you drive, Longmont, I go to Longmont. I mean, we all know that. They just haven't, declared it. So those are my comments. I'm struggling with this becoming just a statewide rule that's going to be there forever. I really struggle with that. with the reduced code requirements. And I think I heard one of the other folks saying my exact comments will be allowing, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, doesn't make any difference, to build these structures. It could be there for a long time with reduced code requirements as compared to everybody else. And I know one of the comments was, well, maybe we should reduce the codes all across the board for everybody. Well, I'm a building official and I respectfully disagree with that, but
I said that in jest.
I'm sorry. I appreciate that comment. So, but there are lots of times I think we're over restricting, don't get me wrong. So those are just my comments. I'm struggling with this. I mean, emergency rule, trying to deal with this. It went through making this a permanent rule I struggle with that if it's going to be based on reduced code requirements. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think these are all great questions. I think that we've got to figure out better ways to get housing. This seems like a move in the right direction. I understand there's ramifications to it and what happens long term, but I do like the ability for communities to figure out what are alternative methods for getting people into housing.
Yeah, I'm totally not against trying to help. I just, I want it to be fair and safe.
Sure.
Totally agree with
that. Another question is, what keeps a local jurisdiction that has authority over their code, creating their own code and zoning and modifications to the IRC? What's to keep them from just doing this as part of their own local code and zoning?
They can only make their code more stringent, not less stringent. The state will override.
Gotcha.
Charlie, that is an excellent question. And so here's how this one came up. City and county of Denver could not handle the on-site inspections, quick turnaround on the plan reviews, and asked us to help out. But you're right. If the factory, and here's the other thing, if we want to make this permanent and allow other factories to bid, other factories would say, yeah, I'm not in the city and county of Denver, therefore I'm not going to be eligible to meet this requirement. This, by making it permanent, would allow any modular manufacturer to bid on these type of projects. And this was a response to an RFP. And so they looked real long and hard about doing it locally, and they certainly could. They could send their inspectors to the factory that is producing these units and do it all themselves.
Oh, okay.
Does that context help?
It does. I think I didn't know that somebody else jumped in and said that the state wouldn't allow a lower code or lower zoning. Does that run into?
So the sentence that I think we're talking about is this modification would allow a less stringent design by a local jurisdiction that has a site-specific information to allow such construction and is approved to that specific jurisdiction. So this ties that unit to that jurisdiction. And so their less stringent design, we basically in our IRC and IBC structure types are pretty clearly defined. Because this is an RX sleeping unit, sleeping shelter. They have, like I said earlier, they've kind of combined some IBC and IRC type of definition. They came up with their own structure type, and they different parts and pieces of codes. It was too hard to require one of our stock structure types to this situation based on how they're going to run these in a community setting.
Okay.
Sam, on 215, I don't know that it matters, but I think we're being a little redundant because the building code already allows alternate materials and methods of construction.
I know, right? That's what I was trying to say earlier. We could have probably gotten away with allowing it by 215. And just saying, yeah, you know, Denver's asked us for this structure type to be allowed. But we wanted to tie it with the state of emergency. We wanted to tie it to city and county in Denver, since they were making that request. But yeah, we talked about that alternative. So I guess the alternative is, instead of making this a permanent rule, to say that in the future, these type of requests, if they come up, would come through on a 2.15 request for
The only thing I see in this is that it conforms with the intent and purposes of the standards and is equivalent in suitability, strength, effectiveness, durability, safety, and sanitation. So I don't know that. Does that mean that the modifications that would be asked for under this 215 would require the same intent and purpose of the standards? So that may be why that, I don't know, that may be an argument that said, oh, you're asking for something that's outside the intent and purposes of this, of the IRC or IBC or the zoning.
The way our thought process was working when we talked about this was, yes, we could have done it under 215, but it would have taken a lot more time to put the codes down side by side, and see what we could allow and what we could not allow, using the Denver adopted code and tying them to the Denver area only, seemed like in a state of emergency, that made a little more sense to us. And then again, our other intent was to look at, after the state of emergency was declared and they put an RFP together, they could quote this rule, if they've in there to any factory built, any manufacturer that wanted to produce these type of units.
Mm-hmm.
In a big situation, and I'm not saying it would be applicable to the Louisville Superior fire, but I know that there were mobile home parks that were completely flooded and wiped out. This could be a temporary solution for something like that. And I'm sorry, not in the Louisville Superior fire, but the floods. There were a couple mobile home parks that were flooded out. So our intent was to kind of open it up to allow other type of manufacturers to come in. I've seen, I don't have a lot of, I haven't done a survey of all the states if they have done anything like this. I know that Georgia recently passed something to allow a state emergency, to allow factory built structures to meet some of their needs. But so that's where I am. That's all I got.
Is the hesitancy among the group the issue about what happens to these after the emergency? Is that the main question?
Yes,
Okay.
it is mine.
Yeah.
Kind of. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who can own these? Who can own these, and what happens to them after the emergency is over? What if we, I mean, if we stayed silent on it, then can't Denver just decide what to do? Or can't the community, what's wrong with just letting the community decide what to do with them after? Because I hesitate to, you know, with the hour that we have to try to wordsmith this or put this together, or that considers all long-term considerations.
I agree with those questions, comments.
In my opinion, the homelessness isn't, I mean, it's an issue, but it's not an emergency. It's something that we're dealing with all the time, right? So
Agreed.
why can't the homeless shelters be designed? There's no rush to get them out. Why can't they be designed per the full code? And then natural emergencies, fires, flooding, those would then apply to short-term, less stringent codes.
Well, I think the argument that the local governments who are declaring the state of emergency would say that they have a right to declare an emergency based on their perception of their community. Like,
Right, we can limit this rule to say this does not include the homeless crisis. I mean,
but again, like you're
those are
telling the
long-term
mayor, then
structures.
but then you're telling the mayor of Denver and the local government what is and what is not an emergency, because they may consider, I mean, we might not consider it, but maybe they do consider it. Maybe it's crime and drugs, and maybe they look at it differently.
And Charlie, that, and Justin, I understand what you're saying. And as a county manager, we actually looked at declaring a state of emergency during some flooding in the unincorporated town of Elbert, hoping that that would open us up to state money or federal money for rebuilding some of Elbert. And basically what I learned is that yes, the county can declare a local emergency for pretty much anything they want. It doesn't open up any other money from other sources unless it's a state declared emergency.
Mm-hmm.
If just kind of a comment, so if this is an emergency declared by the city and county of Denver, can't we geographically restrict these that because of the emergency they have to stay in that jurisdiction?
Mm-hmm.
If they wanted to be moved out someplace else, then maybe it comes back to Division of Housing or something and relooks the code. I don't know that we want to go there, but I'm just thinking that if the city's stick building these things and they're willing to do it to a lower threshold, then it keeps, if we keep out of it, then we the factory built side of it loses out. But if they stick build it and they decide to raise it or whatever, then they're just throwing that money away, which is the same thing they could theoretically do with this. Does that make any sense?
So, yeah, we could put a restriction in there that says that it is expected that these units will stay in the local jurisdiction. If the local jurisdiction decides to relocate or dispose of these units via sale, that the buyers informed that they're designed under a state of emergency. This rule 2.15.3 and may require modifications at the factory before being moved.
To me, that seems like that would help at least our concerns with what's done with these units after the fact.
Mm-hmm. Or we could also put a time restraint on these structures that they are classified in this emergency rule, they will be classified as temporary structures, and give it a time that they're allowed to stay, which then homelessness would be a long-term thing, right? So that would exclude the homeless shelters from claiming this rule, but it would help those during fire and flooding, because they're not going to stay there for long term.
Justin, my only concern is who's going to enforce that, and I'm not sure that I want to keep, in 15 years that we go out there and say, okay, now it's time to destroy them.
Well, not destroy, but I'm assuming that they would have a fleet storage somewhere.
Yeah.
Are these mobile? I mean, are these intended to be mobile units? Are these going to be, because if you're talking IRC, IBC, that infers to me some kind of permanent foundation. Am I wrong?
They're going on they've got tie downs. It's a temporary foundation. Yeah,
Okay.
based on our definitions, it's a temporary foundation.
Okay.
Because we did talk about them going back to the factory, and they would go back in, pick them up on a flatbed, take them back to the factory and modify them if necessary.
Well,
Again-
you know, there are other units that, you know, out in Buena Vista where we are, they have Katrina houses, right? They have some of those FEMA Katrina houses. You know what? I guess I just don't know enough about, you know, why are those okay for people to live in long term, and these might not be.
I don't think I have an answer to that.
Yeah, Katrina houses weren't built, I think they were built under HUD code I don't think they were built for our thermal zones. So I don't know how they would have gotten up there, in all honesty, but again, I think if we can restrict, these are going to this place, they're for this purpose, and agree, if there's a disclosure that, you're going to use it for a different purpose, then it needs to go back to factory, get recertified, get re-inspected, whatever we want to come up with.
Right.
Because I have a feeling that more than likely when these things show up and get set up, they're going to be there for a bit. So I hate to put any kind of time restrictions on it specifically, because they could be there. I mean, when 12 by 60s were started being built in our industry back in the 50s and 60s, they were designed as temporary housing also, but they're still out there. So I don't know that these are going to necessarily move real quick.
But now
Yeah,
you're
that
defeating
would
the
be up
purpose
to
of the
Denver.
emergency, though. If they're long term, they're long term. Build them to the code.
Right. That would be up to the city and county of Denver's compliance and public safety to go around and look and make sure they're still safe.
So if we just say that, because it sounds like the concern is, what happens when the emergency is over and who can own them? Then if we said, they must be owned by government or I'm just throwing this out there, or nonprofits. And if there is a repurposing of them, they may have to go for additional code.
Okay.
I'm just throwing it out there as a solution, because if they 15 years from now they have a bunch of these things and developer wants to come in and buy them, sounds like the group would like that to have to go through a re-inspection of some kind.
So I think we're coming to consensus on this. If you guys will give me a little latitude to come up with a sentence that works to tag into this, that requires them to stay in the local jurisdiction, and any movement outside of that will have to be approved by that the units may have to go back to the factory for modifications for other uses. If you guys will let me do that, I'll get that in. We have time to wordsmith it a little bit more after today, but I will add that before filing tomorrow, and then we can wordsmith it. I'll send it out to the entire TAC with a synopsis of the discussion that we've had today, and the major concerns, and we'll wordsmith it, and then I can do an amended filing at any point in time with the final wording before it goes to be printed in the Colorado Register. Does that make sense?
I still have a comment.
Okay, Tim, go ahead.
I agree with adding something like you're talking about, Sam.
Right.
I still have heartburn, I guess you might call it, as the questions have come up, but quite a few of the members today, is what happens when the state of emergency ends? I mean, these structures, I know people are saying, well, should we put a time limit on, or no, or, yes or no? But if the state of emergency ends, then these structures are there, and they will be there probably for a long time. I mean, some of the comments of short-term housing now become a long-term housing fix in this type of state of emergency. So I think that has to get my vote, that has to be addressed in some manner. And I don't have a recommendation for what that language.
What if we call them transitional housing? Because here's the way I see, I think it may work for city and county of Denver. And I'm trying to think outside of that and think about floods and fires and tornadoes, right? It's transitional housing, and I'd have to look up the formal definition of that, but it is intended to help people move from home for city and county dinner from homelessness to a more permanent resolution. And so that is the intent of the emergency rule, is to provide that transitional housing piece. The CARES Act money and ARPA money both recognize transitional housing as a step to solve the homelessness problem. It's going to be biggest in the city and county of Denver, but everybody's going to be dealing with it some, right? So we can work on wording to add that transitional housing. But yes, those will be there as long as city and county has a homeless
You're
issue.
still talking long term though, because your tenant does not dictate the length of the structure. So
Yeah, I see them, bringing in, filling them up and moving people to more permanent housing. I mentioned the hotels and motels that they're buying and turning into apartments. That's going to take some time. And then bringing in more people as more homeless come out on the street, or those faced with homeless. I need to say that correctly. And so, yes, those will be there for a while.
and I think Tim's on my side on this one too. If they're going to be there for a while, build them to the code. There's no less stringent. Just because it's for a homeless shelter, they shouldn't get lesser stringent.
But is it less stringent or is it just different? I mean, you're building to IRC IBC standards. It's
Yeah.
more of like this doesn't have a kitchen or it doesn't have the same rules of design.
I think Sam mentioned earlier, one of the items I recall hearing was, he answered my question on the fire sprinkler requirement. If Denver doesn't require it, then on any type of IRC, I mean, IBC, all residential, at least in the IBC, requires sprinklers. So maybe they reduce that. I don't know, as to how you get to a mix of IBC, IRC, but it's allowing them to be closer together with, like in a fire separation distance. So it's not as clear what that means or how these things are being built, less restrictive, or, so alternate material and design, I think, is really just how this should be run through, whether it's the locals or, the rules that are in place. And it's like a case by case, jurisdiction specific. That would be my vote. That's how you deal with these. And then, if the mix says, well, in this case, we could allow something, whatever that is, to be less restrictive, then it's site specific, not a general rule. Yeah, I'm still struggling with this.
All right, are you guys okay with me adding a couple sentences and filing it tomorrow and throwing it back, and I'll pull together another TAC meeting to work through it? I can withdraw once we file for a permanent rule. We can withdraw at any point in time before the public hearing.
I'm fine since we're restricted this timeline. I think that's reasonable.
I would agree.
I would agree.
Okay,
I'd agree.
thank you. I appreciate it. And I'll do that. While I've got you guys on the line, I just want to talk about future rulemaking. This is where I mentioned earlier, we have an effective date for IEC IEC 2021 of 1/1/25. We talked in the last TAC meeting about bumping up the all the building codes from the 2018 set. And we're on the 2015 IECC now. I'm wondering if now isn't a time to start talking about that. My thought was if we bump to the 2021 ICC codes effective 6/30 of 24, that would allow 180 days for everybody to change and get ready for so the drop dead date then would meet the intent of statute to be on 2021 IECC by 1/1 of 25. So that's why I'm thinking we need to start making doing rulemaking on that. Of course, then I'd like to do any cleanup of the last set of rules. I've noticed a couple of typos I want to clean up and suggest, and that's why I suggested a start date for TAC meetings in January of 2024. What I don't know, the big caveat here is I don't know if the legislative session is going to have anything new, but we would start that after 6/30 of 24 with another set of TAC meetings for legislative changes. The other thing that's on this slide that I'm sharing with you is we've had some discussions informally about legislative changes, the things that I'm tracking. If you guys have other things you'd like for me to track on here, is third-party plan review is final. The caveat with that is that we would move into more of an audit type of role, and designation of responsible parties for on-site construction, and then removal of the manufacturer financial surety requirements, which we just put in with HB 22-1242. Those are the three things that I'm tracking so far. Any thoughts or comments? And I'll send this out to everybody on the TAC before we have the next meeting, so we have some time to discuss.
I have a comment on the third party. I'm thinking about this structurally.
Yep.
I'm licensed in Colorado, and once I started doing some Colorado projects, I had not realized that Denver had its own wind speeds, and also the I believe it's codified. Their wind speeds are kind of strange to me, and I don't know that they've been updated in a while. But the third party would also have to understand that you can't just go pull the wind speed from the ASCE tool. It has to be what's provided by the local, and I'm sure they're staying up to date, but I don't know that all third parties would know that a higher wind speed should be being used.
And so, Justin, we kick back a lot of plans right now because every plan set has to have an address. Yes, it will be education of the third-party agencies, but we kick a lot back for wrong wind, snow loads, winter design temps, sprinkler requirements, and now we've also added wildfire mitigation as a local jurisdiction requirement also. We've got most of them pretty well educated that they have to go check the local building codes.
Okay.
For wind, snow, wind load, snow load, winter design temp, fire sprinklers, and now wildfire.
Is there a state certification for the third party? Do they have to have?
No, but I've actually thought about registering a registration program for third parties to allow a little more control over them. Right now, they just say, yeah, I'm a third party and I'm doing it for this manufacturer.
Yeah, I think if there's some certification process that would not have to take very long, but would address these common issues.
Yep. Oh, the other thing that I've got to put into rulemaking is a potential fee increase too. I'm sorry, I don't have it on there, but I'll add that before it goes out. Tim, thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it. And we'll set up another TAC meeting to finalize this before it goes to State House.
Good deal. All right. Thanks all. Great discussion. See y'all.
Hey, great. Thank you, everybody.
All right, so I just wanted to share that with everybody to kind of justify why I think we need to start in January for more formal TAC meetings. Does that sound okay to everybody?
Do we now have a quorum?
Oh, yeah, no, we don't have to have a forum. We're now in open discussion.
Okay.
Justin and Sean.
Yeah, no, that's fine with me.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm,
All right, cool. Well, thank you guys for your time today. I appreciate it. And we're done. I'll try to figure out how to turn off the recording. And
All right.
you guys have a great day.
Thanks a lot, Sam.
thanks, you too.